questions internationally. So thank you to all of the international panelists who are here this morning. And again, thank you to all of my colleagues who are able to raise their questions and give their comments and input. We will now move on to the second item on our agenda this morning. This is an exchange of views on the human rights situation in the United States after the death of George Floyd. Well, here we are today. We decided to add this item to the agenda for today's meeting because we were all shocked by what took place in the United States. That we saw this young African-American George Floyd die live under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer. So this was a chilling scene where we saw someone die in a live feed, and it is a reminder of things that have happened in contemporary U.S. history. Now, this police brutality was followed by a wave of indignation, which goes beyond social classes, ethnic groups, and political affiliations in the United States. And I would even say beyond the U.S. borders, because we have seen demonstrations in European cities in our countries. The European Union reacted via its High Representative, Mr. Borrell, who said that this was an abuse of power which must be denounced in the United States and elsewhere. The United States remains a great democracy. There are checks and balances in place and an independent judiciary. The police officer who caused the death of Floyd has been charged with murder, and the investigation is ongoing to determine the responsibility of his fellow police officers who were standing by his side when this took place. Let us not forget that we have to really understand the causes of this endemic racial police violence and its consequences in the U.S., a country severely hit by the COVID-19 health crisis. And we also know that the COVID-19 health crisis affected the African-American community much more than other communities in the U.S., in fact, to the tune of 2 times as hard. So we know that these are many crucial aspects, the health crisis, but the economic crisis as well that is looming both in our countries in the European Union, but in the United States as well. Now, without further ado, I should like to give the floor for 8 to 10 minutes to each of our speakers, and I would like to really thank them for having taken up our invitation on such short notice. I'd like to begin by Ms. Gay J. McDougall, who is a professor at the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. So the Center for Race, Law, and Justice at the Fordham University School of Law. Ms. Gay was also a former vice chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and a former UN Special Rapporteur on Minorities. Then we will have our second expert, Mr. Pap Ndiaye, who is a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He is a historian and a specialist in the United States. Your books have been translated into several languages, and the most recent one is Black Americans, A March for Equality and History of Chicago with Andrew Diamond. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. McDougall. You have 10 minutes for your presentation, madam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I want to express my great gratitude for the invitation to address this body of the European Parliament about the current crisis in the United States. And I want to particularly thank Ms. Soraya Rodriguez, the MP that put my name forward to speak today. I came to tell you about the situation that we've been dealing with in the U.S. that we think is of grave concern. Let me first say that our greatest concern is that the violence and the counter-violence that are diverting the gaze of the international community away from the pain being expressed by a nation in mourning over 100,000 recent deaths from the coronavirus, the vast majority of whom were Black and brown and indigenous peoples, because of the deficit in healthcare experienced by these groups over their lifetimes. We are concerned about how injustice in the country seems to never end, and equality never comes. It was a brutal situation that occurred on the streets in Minneapolis. To watch these policemen, with great callousness, spend 9 minutes pressing on the back and the neck of this man as he kept saying he could not breathe, he could not breathe. And, you know, the reality is that his death is one of a string of deaths of innocent people, unarmed, by police across the country. But the real demand of the demonstrators is that the endemic racism, the hatred, the fear, and the disparities finally be fully confronted and dealt with and ended. We're deeply concerned that the escalation in violence, which has not stopped yet, in police responses to the peaceful protests in the United States, which included the use of rubber bullets, of tear gas, of pepper spray, and in some cases live ammunition, in violation of international standards of the use of force, that this is continuing and escalating. Additionally, we're greatly concerned that rather than using his position to serve as a force for calm and unity, President Trump has chosen to weaponize the tensions through his rhetoric. And this is evidenced by, for example, his promise to seize the authority of governors who failed to use the most extreme tactics of violence against the protesters, and his promise to deploy federal armed forces, the Army, the military, on the streets of the U.S. against civilian protesters, which, by the way, is an action that is of questionable legality, even under U.S. laws. I mean, 7 people have been struck by gunfire during the protests across the country, including one man who was just serving the demonstrators sandwiches. You know, pepper spray and rubber bullets have been used in numerous places, including Phoenix, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Minneapolis. And according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 200 journalists who were covering these events have been physically attacked, intimidated, or arbitrarily arrested, despite their press credentials being clearly visible. And in the meantime, the president is labeling the protesters as terrorists. Democracy, but we are fearing for our democracy. And this is the time to try to salvage it. And so I see that my time is running short, and I don't want to take up the time without having some left to answer questions and clarify our position. So, Madam Chair, if I could at this point turn it back to you and say that I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you. You have a little bit more time if you want to say something more. You have 3 minutes more. But if you want to have the question, we will give you the floor after the question. It's as you want. If you want to take the floor more, you have still 3 minutes more. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just didn't want to go over time. But there is much more to say. But I do want to make clear that the arrest of the policeman in Minneapolis only happened after the protests against the injustice got to a critical level. And I think there's no question that the charges, the most serious charges against him and the charges finally leveled against the other policemen involved in this incident only came after sustained protests. This is not the way a democracy is to work. Our ability to make our voices heard, our rights of protest, our rights of assembly should be enabled by government. And that is certainly not been the case. Finally, a lot of this has happened, yes, in the context of the coronavirus sort of endemic, sort of hit to the United States, which is hit harder than any place else. And we fear as well that, as we hear from health specialists, that tear gas may place individuals at a higher risk of contracting a respiratory illness in the context of weakened systems under the coronavirus. And the mass arrest and detention of protesters will exacerbate their risk of infection in jails that are equally already an epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. We are sending to the UN this week a letter to the UN Council on Human Rights requesting that they hold a special session on the crisis in the U.S. And making appropriate action. We would like to see a commission of inquiry formed, which is not unusual to such situations taken up by the UN Council on Human Rights. And we would hope that the countries of the European Union that are on the Council will support this and vote in favor of it and encourage other states to do that as well. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I give the floor, je vais donner la parole tout de suite à Papendiaï.
I'd like to give the floor to Papendiaï from the Institute on Public Security specialized in the United States. Now, we heard you speaking yesterday and your contribution was extremely interesting, so I'd like to hand over to you now.
Poussez le bouton Speak, please, s'il vous plaît. Monsieur Ndiaye, poussez le bouton Speak.
Bien, on vous voit, mais on ne vous entend pas.
We can see you. We have an image, but no sound at present.
Allez-y, monsieur. Je pense que maintenant... Voilà. Monsieur, vous nous...
We cannot hear any sound coming from this connection.
Monsieur?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, je vous entends. Je pense que je vais vous inviter à augmenter un petit peu le volume de votre ordinateur.
D'accord.
Et c'est bien. Nous vous entendons. Vous avez la parole.
We can now hear the speaker, albeit quietly. Now, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Madam Chair, for inviting me. I think it's right that the Human Rights Committee of the European Parliament should be looking at the human rights situation in the United States. Now, the racial tensions in the United States have become a central issue, even more so now than in the aftermath of the death of Michael Brown, when protests erupted at the time and took on a major dimension. But what we're seeing now is the biggest wave of protests since the 1960s. We are seeing now, unlike in 2014, a very diverse group of citizens coming together, African Americans, but also white American citizens who are coming out, people who have remained absent. Then the sound has unfortunately been lost. We can no longer hear the speaker.
Ndiaye, on a un problème avec votre...
Professor Diaye, unfortunately the connection has been lost, says the chair.
Allez-y, normalement, maintenant nous...
Go ahead. I think we've established the connection. Yes. So as I was saying, we have a very specific situation now in the context of a health crisis and an economic crisis. Now, there are two things I'd like to raise now, and also, so I'd like to give you some information, first of all. The first piece of information for you is that with the mobilization, social mobilization on these issues is growing, and the role of this protest. Now, had there been no protest, no wave of reaction, then the officer would have been charged with involuntary homicide. And in the United States, simply, the consequence of this is third-degree murder charges, and then generally a jury will acquit the officer. Now, if the charges were raised, then this is a direct consequence of the protest. Now, this is part of a wider protest against police violence and police institutional racism. None of this would be possible without protests. Now, second point of information for you is when the central state gets involved or simply, ignores the problems or even supports indirectly supremacist or indirectly supports police violence, as President Trump has been known to do in the case of events in Charlottesville, for example, then all this does is to compound the situation that already exists. It makes matters worse. And in institutionally racist organizations, such as the police force, the force may feel empowered. Once again, the sound has unfortunately been lost, and we can no longer hear the speaker. We will try to reconnect you. We haven't missed everything. We've just lost the sound at the very end of what you were saying.
Voilà, je pense que vous m'entendez.
I believe you can hear me again now.
Yes, the connection is not reliable, it seems. As I was saying, it's important for public authorities and state authorities to consider their reaction and consider the risks in a situation that is escalating quite clearly. Now, let me just say a few words about what's happening in Europe. We are seeing protest erupt now in synchronization with what's going on in the United States. Now, that's happened in France, as you will know, but also in the United Kingdom. Protest has taken place in Canada, Australia, Brazil, too. So I think it would be wrong to believe that these issues of racially motivated violence is a purely American issue. These issues resonate with citizens in Europe, in France, and in other countries across the globe. Now, the level of violence perpetrated by the police forces in the United States is presumably far worse than anything that we have seen and witnessed in Europe. But these questions of violence against minorities are questions that we need to confront in Europe too. The at.Mr case, like the George Floyd case, has been given visibility now in these protests that we've seen flaring up in major cities across France. So, just to conclude with the questions I'd like to raise for you. The methods used by law and order forces in order to maintain public order need to be placed under close scrutiny. Once again, the sound has been lost.
On va se reconnecter, vous inquiétez pas.
We will reconnect you.
Voilà,
Voilà, pardon. Donc je disais.
My apologies. As I was saying, when it comes to maintaining public order, these matters need to be discussed publicly. And the problem in the United States is that this is left solely for the Ministry of Interior to decide on. I think institutions, civil society, citizens should have a role to play when it comes to maintaining law and order and public order. Now, another question that's relevant perhaps for Europe Now, my impression is that the European Parliament does have a role to play in this matter. The Parliament may wish to give some advice, some recommendations at the European level. I believe that some efforts in this sense have already been undertaken, but this may be particularly relevant during this time. But when it comes to the situation in the United States, that specific situation, there too the European Parliament should have a say and ensure that its voice is heard. and offer clear, unequivocal support to those protesters and voice criticism vis-à-vis the Trump administration, perhaps in a similar way to the Canadian Prime Minister's statements on the matter. And I think there should be a wider reflection on what is happening in Europe, and this should be perhaps accompanied with the reflection on what's going on. There shouldn't be any impression that that Europe is immune to an escalation of this kind of violence or this type of thing happening in Europe. Now, young people in Europe may be experiencing things that maybe are not as extreme as what's going on in the United States, but certainly go some way to being problematic in the same way.
Conclusion, on va directement passer la parole.
We'll hear directly from the members of the committee now. Thank you to both of you. You really put forward a wealth of information with your analysis of what's happening in the US, but also regarding our vision of Europe. And we can't deny the existence of racism. There have been studies and surveys in Europe in recent times which show that there is an increase of racism in Europe. So it's important to look at that. Now we'll hear from the different political groups. We'll start with Isabelle Wiesler from the EPP group. Sorry. So that we hear everyone, I ask you to not speak for more than 1 minute 30. Then we can also have a second round of questions. So please stick to that 1 minute 30. I want to say how distressing the images are that we've seen. The fact that this even happened, the fact that the man was on the ground, and that this happened in our society, that ultimately he died suffocated by a policeman. That's absolutely shocking, distressing. I'd also like to say that what we saw yesterday, last night, we saw some of the demonstrations in the US, in the big cities, with lots of young people present. That was a sign of hope. I have two thoughts I'd like to share with you, which I consider important. The last speaker spoke about the violence of police officers in the US and elsewhere. Do you think that is due to the fact that there is widespread carrying of arms in the US, so perhaps greater violence? So the police officers don't know whether a potential perpetrator has a weapon or not. So does that have an effect? Now, it is also true that there is latent racism in America and here in Europe. When I was looking at the demonstrators, I thought to myself, will there be any positive change that comes of this? And then what can we do? What can we do to make a positive change? Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Now I hear from Nacho Sanchez from the Socialist Group. Thank you, Maria. It's so difficult to squeeze everything into 1 minute 30. This is an issue I looked at when I was in the Parliamentary Assembly. Now, this police brutality with its racial element has become a real scourge on democracy because it's become so systemic. There is this cultural framework which has been fed into by Trump with his racial policies, racist policies. But and then also the reaction of the authorities has really been clumsy. You know, Trump pushes for law and order. This has actually ultimately led to the death of George Floyd. And then, as the professor referred to, the scandal is that there was an immediate charge brought on the police officers by the authorities. The question is, had there been no protests, would there have been proper charges brought against the police officers? So this brings us into the issues of racism, but also the issue of the prosecutors in the US. And what about the protest? There is a little bit of violence in the protest. That allows the more conservative wings to focus away from the death of George Floyd, and they're focusing in on the small part of violence of the demonstrations. I want to focus on police behaviour. The problem isn't necessarily weapons. There is structural. But there is this problem of weapons, and this leads to an exaggerated, over-the-top response of the police officers in the US, which we don't necessarily see in Europe. So I think we need to look at the mechanisms of micro-power as well, and also structures. I think that if there is a change in police protocols, that could allow things not to get out of control, as they have in the US. Thank you, Nacho. Maria Soraya Rodriguez now. Thank you. Thank you to the two experts. Thank you, Professor McDougall. On behalf of my parliamentary group, we're glad to have this debate because we thought we cannot stay in silence as we see the protests in the US that have been caused by the horrific images of the death of George Floyd. A terrible 8 minutes and 45 seconds, almost 9 minutes, which struck the world and which are etched on our memories. And this has caused a wave of demonstrations in the US, but these are now present in Berlin, Copenhagen, Paris, London, and Madrid. This points out a structural problem of racism, inequality and violence. An inequality which has been illustrated by COVID. The African American community has suffered more than others with COVID. Structural racism is an international problem. It's not a US problem, it's a problem for all of us. We in Europe must remember that we need to fight against hate messaging, wherever it comes from political leaders or organisms who blame all of our problems on others. They say, it's foreigners who are causing this, often people with of a different skin colour. We cannot remain in silence. Violence is not the answer. A violent response has never been a way of maintaining rights or maintaining democracy. That's why today we need to hear the voices of the protesters. They are a reminder. It's more urgent than ever to move forward and to turn the page on this chapter, which includes normalization of racial discrimination. In this regard, I'd like to ask you, how can we align our efforts in this moment with you so that we can effect substantial change? Thank you. Thank you, Maria Soraya.
To Jack Madison pour le groupe ID.
Jack Madison for the ID group.
Good morning. Do you hear me?
You have the floor.
Yeah, that's great. Good morning to everyone. It's a very interesting debate here has been in the morning. I want to focus on the three different topics. The first of all, of course, we are very sad for the George Floyd's family, and we are very absolutely disappointed what happened like in the US by this accident. But what I've heard like all the morning here on the meeting, I am also actually disappointed. We have seen over the week on the big media, and we have seen also in the morning here in the committee meeting, that nobody is saying against the brutality of the protesters when they're destroying, when they are burning, when they are actually destroying the property, others' lives. A few days ago, one black ex-police officer were killed by the protesters. But we have seen all the time in the media and also by the mainstream politicians that they are like the peaceful protesters who are just trying to fight against the police brutality. But it's actually a lie, because if you see like the the facts, what's happening in the US just now, it's not like the peaceful protests. It's just like the chaos. It's anarchism, where also a lot of things to do with Antifa, with the left-wing radicals, and we are saying nothing against them from the European Union, and it's a really big shame. And secondly, I'm also very glad that everybody's fighting against racism, but it feels for me that the racists can be...
Sorry, I have to cut you, so I give the floor to A.D. Otala.
Yeah, thank you very much. Chair, George Floyd and Michael Brown are not just simply statistics, and they're definitely not accidents, as the previous speaker has indicated. They are a testament of a deep trouble that the United States has failed to address for far too long. Now, the police should not be there to shoot when some loot. The police should be there to protect. And it is clear that wide-scale reforms in the law enforcement in the United States are needed. The US should take a close look at the 6 pillars of President Obama's task force report on 21st century policing. The 6 pillars address issues such as building trust, oversight and training. And the report also looks closely at community policing, which emphasises working with neighbourhoods residents to co-produce public safety. I'm very glad to hear that now we are also able to look at the issues in Europe. Let me mention that there is a Danish law submitting people living in ethnically profiled residential areas to different standards on human rights. And this is totally unacceptable. We cannot go on with European direct discrimination of this kind. So we need to address the EU situation. We need an EU framework for national strategies for the social inclusion of ethnic minorities. We need to collect equality data which are disaggregated by racial and or ethnic origin. And the EU Council should unblock the Anti-Discrimination Horizontal Directive. And we need a European Anti-Racism Summit on combating structural discrimination in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I give the floor to Miguel Urban Crespo from the GUE. Miguel, for 1 minute and a half, you have the floor.
Mr. Urban, press your speak button, please.
Okay.
Sí.
Gracias.
Thank you, Chair. We've seen this wave of protests against institutionalized racism, exclusion, police brutality, where there is surprising impunity. And this shows that this is a system that impoverishes people. Trump, rather than looking for a solution, has just fanned the flames. He says that he wants to send the army to the street. And he's even accusing the protesters of being terrorists. And speaks out about Antifa. But actually, we see that there's white supremacism there. I want to say that clearly. The discrimination suffered by African American communities has many faces. There's greater poverty, greater unemployment, and these are the scourges we have to fight. We have to fight institutionalized racism and inequality. But we cannot look at the death of George Floyd, this murder, as a structural issue. In the US, we need to take a look at our own doorstep in Europe. We are not immune to discrimination, racism, police violence, and the cracking down of protests. We saw similar deaths at the hands of the police in France, Belgium, enslaved people in Andalusia. So racism is a scourge that we have to clamp down on in Europe and the US. We mustn't be hypocrites. We have to look at the problems on our own doorstep and point out the victims of institutionalized racism in both Europe and the US alike. Thank you.
Floor now, it's the second round, so I give the floor to Kelly Schön from the EPP.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the speakers. I could never all my life understand how a person could be judged by the colour of their skin. For me, my greatest heroes were black people. Muhammad Ali, the best boxer the world has ever known. Tiger Woods, the best golfer the world has ever known. Usain Bolt, the fastest man ever in the world. What we saw in America was chilling in the extreme. I think it indicates what can happen when you have poor leadership. Leaders can either divide or unite. Good unite, bad divide. And that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, in America at the moment. But also, we must look at ourselves in Europe. And if we could use George Floyd's death for us to look at maybe areas where there's racial discrimination right across Europe, do survey on it and try and eliminate it. And also look at the powers and the training that police officers get. I just can't understand how any police officer around the world would put his knee on a person who was handcuffed for 8.5 minutes. I mean, it makes no sense, but it must have come from somewhere. So we need to look at the training of police, what restrictions and advice they're given, and we should look at it in Europe, and also, of course, urge America to do the same. I welcome this debate. I hope that we can use George Floyd and his memory to end racial discrimination in Europe and America and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à Raphaël Glucksmann.
Now we'll hear from Raphael Glucksmann.
Pour le groupe socialiste.
Raphael for the S&D group. I hand over to you.
Push the button, please. The speak button, Mr. Glucksmann.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais...
Thank you, Chair. I want to repeat our complete solidarity and horror faced with this institutional murder. There is a history of racism which is specific to the US. The sound is extremely bad. Extremely bad. I can't interpret this. It's hurting my ear. Sorry.
À l'hypocrisie quand on vient d'Europe. Je vois le mouvement de solidarité incroyable à travers l'Europe qui s'exprime. Pourtant, eh bien, nos polices en Europe ne sont pas exemptes de pratiques.
Okay, the sound is a bit better. Our own police are not free of racism. We in the US saw a demonstration which was not just a demonstration of solidarity with the American protesters and those who in the US who have been outraged by the death of George Floyd. But our demonstration was about the death of Adam McCrowry. So when our police get out of hand, we have policemen making a cross. We have people who are enslaved in Andalusia. So we have to look at what's happening in Europe. It's not just the issue of the US. And I'm glad that Mr. NDI mentioned what's happening in Europe. I think we in the European Parliament have to work and start thinking about how structural racism is part of our own police forces and how it pollutes our own police forces. So it's not just about solidarity with the US, it's about what's happening on our own doorstep. Now, the whole reason we have this subcommittee on human rights is to look at democracy and the fragility of our own democracy in the light of these events. Now we'll hear from Katlin Che from the Renew Group.
Madam Chair, please press your speak button. Madam Chair, I do it for you, okay?
I have a small deviation to Article 2 because I've forgotten to mention that also we want to have energy poverty.
Mrs. Chair?
Poverty included.
So we have a problem with your connection. Is it possible?
And in the Article 3.
So I give the floor to Karin Karlsbro from Renew also.
Press your speak button, please, Mrs.
Yes,
Karlsbro.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. The death of George Floyd has moved us all. I find myself asking, how could this happen? How can this violence be committed by the police, the very people working to uphold law and order? America has a long and tragic history of police brutality. At the heart of this lies racism and segregation based on history. This is a systematic problem that needs to be addressed at all levels in the US. Unfortunately, we find ourselves with Donald Trump as president. Instead of unifying the country, he is doing the opposite. Trump is inciting hatred and encouraging violence. Instead of working against police brutality and segregation, he reinforces distrust and racism. We have all a duty to speak out and take action. This week, people all over the world posted a black square under the hashtag Blackouts Tuesday. We did it to show solidarity. Now, action must follow. The EU must clearly condemn the rhetoric of the US president and the police brutality in all its forms. Impunity for police who commit these acts are not an option. Finally, let this be a reminder of the need for us to constantly work against racism, also in Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Munir Satouri. Munir, tu as la...
Munir, the floor is yours for 1 minute, 30 seconds, on behalf of the Greens.
Munir, tu as la...
Munir, the floor is yours. We can see you. Yes, first, thank you, Madam Chair, for organizing this debate. I think that it is to our credit that we debate any types of infringement of the right to assemble or any type of racism. We have to debate this democratically, and I'm so happy to see that we're doing that today. Thank you to the presenters this morning. I think, indeed, what we can see is happening in the United States is extremely worrisome. European democracies are facing similar challenges. In France, we saw demonstrations during the Yellow Vest protests when the use of force was a regular occurrence. I'd like to know what the experts think about the use of tear gas or any other types of weapons to be used against political, peaceful protest. I'd also like the European Parliament and our committee to come up with a real process of coming up with recommendations for the United States for the right of upholding the rights of a peaceful assembly and fighting any type of violence as expressed by police or the government against people, and to fight any type of racism. In Europe is also affected by populism. In the United States, we've seen that Trump has really stoked tensions, and he has spread the extreme right movements that he has supported through his rhetoric, and we have similar problems in Europe as well, and I hope that the European Parliament will be exemplary in calling for the rule of law and any type of fighting of the use of force against protesters. So thank you very much, Munir. I'd like to give the floor to Minir Pineda for GUE.
Manu.
Hello, and yes, thank you, Chairman. George Floyd's murder by the police puts on the table a big issue for the European Union and the protecting of human rights. We know that President Trump is just one example of the greater problem that exists in the United States. There has been a brutal repression of peaceful protest, and it must be addressed. I apologize, the sound quality is not very good. The assassination of Martin Luther King was a case when the military came to this street, and this was put to the service of the whole population. The police force, some 10,000 people have been arrested, and we don't have a full list of deaths or casualties. Now, the president has called for more use, and the White House has become a bunker. The U.S. president is giving a military response to a social movement. The EU must respond. There are violations of human rights, and I hope that we could raise this in the next plenary of the European Parliament and that this committee would support that.
I have to cut you, Manu. I give the floor to the last one is Ms. Che, if it's possible to have you now.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm here. Okay. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, and thank you very much for organizing this very important and timely meeting. As we all witness in our respective countries as well, outrage all over the world has grown at the fate suffered by George Floyd, whose heart stopped after a police officer knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. There is a seemingly increasing spiral of violence, which is coupled by the brutality of authorities, and this fills me with concern day after day. It is very hard to understand the transformative effect that the current wave of protests might have on American politics, which will no doubt reverberate across the Atlantic as well. Because these demonstrations in the US have resonated around the world, and solidarity protests are held in every country. And these protests highlight not only police violence against people of color, but also inequalities in health, education, employment, and racial discrimination. And at the core of this rage is a legitimate fear for persons of color all over the world, and especially for Black Americans. The sense that they can be killed anywhere, at any time, by anyone, especially by law enforcement. As they turn to exercise their most basic rights as citizens, they have encountered even more contempt for those rights from the people who are supposed to protect them. We have to heal these wounds, and it won't be easy, but we need to try. And we should not forget that discrimination is a widely existing reality in Europe as well, and we have to draw a lesson from what is happening in the US to make sure that our policies are inclusive and people do not experience discrimination based on their skin color, gender, nationality, or religion in any aspects of their lives. So this House, this Parliament, has to fight for this, and our group, the Renew Europe, will be staunch supporter for equality, protection, and equal opportunities for everybody all around the world.
Thank you, Kathleen. Je vais directement passer la...
I'd like to give the floor directly to our two panelists. Mr. Pap Ndiaye, you have the floor because I know that you need to leave, and the interpreting team has agreed to an overrun, and the chairwoman thanks them for that. Mr. Ndiaye, could you... you may speak now. You have the floor, sir.
No, on ne vous entend pas.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
you. All right. Thank you all for your well-taken points. I just want to insist on a couple of points. The first one is related to the issue of mass circulation of weapons in the United States, which is obviously a very important point that partly explains the high level of violence that is well documented really when it comes to the United States. And Madame la députée, you were right when insisting on this point. It doesn't explain everything, though. George Floyd, for example, was peaceful. He had no weapons, and he was literally killed bare-handed by this policeman. So the issue of police brutality goes beyond the issue of weapons, although they are interrelated, of course. My second point would be about the European Parliament itself, which I think should make a priority of the issue of the democratic control of police forces in Europe. As
On va vous reprendre. We will start again. We will start again. Just one second.
Okay, so my second issue is that the European Parliament should make a priority of the issue of the democratic control of police forces. Indeed, all these issues, as many of you said, are also European issues, not only American issues, even if there are indeed differences between the United States and Europe. But when it comes to Europe, the use of military-style weapons, the practice of race profiling, the equivalent of the stop and frisk in the United States, the degraded relations between the police and the French youth, but I suspect that these issues are also prevalent in many European countries, should be dealt by the European Parliament. And I believe that you all have a duty in this respect. These issues are not commonly debated in French political life. They seem to be swept under the rug, and I think it's a huge democratic problem, and things could change, and I believe that the European Parliament could do something about it. I also think that the European Parliament could organize a meeting or some kind of major event when the dust settles down a little bit in a few weeks or maybe in the fall, inviting American activists, people who participated in the current movement, also inviting activists from different organizations such as the NAACP or the Anti-Defamation League. All these organizations have a long experience of police brutality and various forms of institutional racism. I think we could definitely benefit from the American experience, so to speak, and use this experience when addressing
We will refresh your page because we are not hearing you anymore.
There is also a symbolic dimension, of course, when organizing such a meeting. As I said, it would also be a way, of course, for the European Parliament to manifest its solidarity with the Americans who are currently expressing their rage, their frustration, and their political demands vis-à-vis the police as well as the judicial. So I think it would be a very good idea for us in Europe, but also for our American friends, colleagues, and all those who fight racism in the United States. It would be a very good idea for the Parliament to organize something a little substantial, possibly in the fall, something that could also attract attention and possibly issue some guidelines for the members of the European Union regarding the proper way to democratize the relationship between the police and the population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will propose your proposal to have this meeting with activists, US activists on this issue. And so we will come back to you and to organize and to propose it to the coordinator meeting here in the DROI committee. I give the floor to Mrs. McDougall, if we are still with us. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I just want to emphasize a couple of points. First of all, George Floyd is one in a whole series of innocent black people who have been killed just over the last few weeks. So, we talk about people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, David McTeer, Tony McDowell, and we can go on back. So this is not an outlier situation. It is happening almost daily. Secondly, I think that when we talk about really addressing this situation, we've got to go far beyond the question of police reform. Police reform is very important. But there have been attempts already. I think that on the side of the police and on the side of protesters, of ordinary Americans, the problem runs much, much deeper than that. And that's what we got to finally get to. There's endemic racism that goes all the way back for decades and decades and decades and on into the period of slavery, which had really been addressed. The inequalities, the disparities that have been suddenly realized when twice as many black and brown people die from the coronavirus as whites. But nothing is ever done to change these disparities. We've got to get to that. Let's not just deal with the surface issues, although George Floyd's life was not just a surface issue. Finally, I just want to make a couple of points about what you've got to think about and should think about in terms of Europe. There are many relationships between Europe and the United States. And you've got to consider which of those should be cut off, terminated, made conditional on the adherence of the United States to the rule of law and human rights obligations that it's already signed on to. There are relationships between police forces in the United States and various ones in Europe. You got to think about things like export restrictions on equipment used to target peaceful protesters and European journalists. There should be an investigation of what materials have been sourced from Europe that have been eventually used against peaceful protesters in ways that violate the sensibilities of Europe. So I think that there's some, while I agree very much with the idea of a large meeting that makes a statement, I think that there are some really concrete measures that can be taken and should be taken right away to express the dissidence between what's happening in the United States and the values that have been the sort of foundation of the relationships heretofore between Europe and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your ideas. So it's really important. We will work on it. 3 years ago, we organized